We're going to have our intro to web scraping workshop, but before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about Blueprint in itself. If you haven't heard of us, basically we're a student org who strives to make technology accessible and useful to those who create communities and promote public welfare. Basically, that means we're a group of students that use our technical skills for social good by building software for nonprofits. We're working with Girls Inc. Metro Denver, Thinking Huts, and Safe House Denver. For Girls Inc., we are helping them build a web app that lets them bring their after school extracurricular programming to the girls they serve remotely. Because of the pandemic, they've been really struggling connecting with the folks they serve. Thinking Huts, we're helping them learn how or helping them get information about local suppliers for them to 3D print schools in Madagascar. And this project is super cool, especially if you're interested in web scraping, because that's exactly what they're doing. Like they're scraping the web to get that information. So I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Safe House Denver, we are working on redesigning their database. So lots of really cool stuff going on. If you're interested in getting involved, let me know. I'll feel free to stick around after the workshop and ask me questions. Time to get into the web scraping part. If you haven't heard about web scraping or what it is, basically it's just a way to get data. And I say that because there are lots of ways to get data, right? You have databases, APIs, all that good stuff. And web scraping is just one of those methods. Basically, the process is that you have like public information available on websites, and then you just grab them using your web scraping tool and then process them to be in some sort of structured and useful format. Now, you might have noticed that like if you have an API or like a database, that's already on like this right-hand side here, right? Like those are processed pieces of data. The only time you really want to web scrape is if you don't already have that data accessible to you. So this is like maybe glorified copy and paste is like a good way to think about it, because you just basically grab a bunch of rote information, process it a little bit, and make it like fancy and usable for you. Which brings me to like, why do we use web scraping? As I mentioned, like you really only use it as a last resort, right? If you don't already have available information through an API or a database. And but despite the fact that it's glorified web or glorified copy and paste, at least it is automated. One reason why we use web scraping is because, true, it is just copy and paste, but doing that by hand would be painful. So we don't do that. It's also very useful for research and analysis of public data, especially those who are doing like information science work that studies like the propagation of information throughout the internet and also just how people use it, right? So a lot of that data you have to analyze organically, and that's where web scraping really comes in and is useful. Real life application, I'm sure all of you have heard of Google. If you hadn't, I'd be a little bit concerned. But Google is basically a giant web scraping tool. It basically crawls the internet all the time and just grabs information from it. So I've answered the what, I've answered the why, and now it's time to answer the how for web scraping, right? Like how does it work? And for that, I'm gonna go take a trip down memory lane a little bit. Throwback to back in September, fall 2020, Wik had this awesome event called Wiki Welcome. Basically, we all played the Wiki search game, and it's super fun. And it is also a super good way to portray web scraping and just figure out how the mechanics work behind it. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna play a game, because why not? Basically, what we're going to do is we're going to play the wiki search game. Basically, the mechanics of the game, right? We have to start in a location and then branch out from there. And that's actually really similar to like how web scraping works, specifically like the crawling portion. Basically, what I'm trying to get at is web scraping is pretty much the wiki game, but on steroids, because you don't just stop at like clicking one location or just focusing on the clicking and getting to a goal, right? Um, while the traversal method is very similar, there are two major differences that we have to pay attention to. So one is that when you're web scraping, you don't just click on one link. You click on all of the links, right? Because we're trying to like branch out from a single location and cover as much ground. Granted, I say all of the links, and that's probably an exaggeration because sometimes you want to sort out which sort of websites you visit. But for our purposes, typically web scraping involves in visiting different, like multiple places as opposed to just doing like one path. Okay, second major difference is that unlike this game where we were just trying to get from point A to point B, web scraping tries to enjoy the journey, i.e. it actually does things on each page. It grabs a large amount of data from each of the websites. So with a Wiki game, it would have like grabbed the whole article instead of just going on to the next one. So as you might have noticed from that description, there are two main components for web scraping. There's the web crawling part, which is the component that finds each of the web pages. And that was like us clicking through the links, right? Um, and the second component is web scraping. It's the process of extracting information from a web page. And that's the part we didn't really see in the wiki game. This part actually needs to be really quick and accurate because it's so much data and you have to go to multiple web pages, right? So we have to make sure that that process is efficient in order to have an efficient web scraper. We're basically going to focus on the web scraping component because each of these, like the web crawling and the web scraping sections, are sort of their own beast, right? They're all like pretty hefty components. And just for the given time constraints today, we're going to go over web scraping. But before we hop into the demo, I wanted to talk a little bit about web scraping controversy and ethics. I'm sure a lot of you have heard about web scraping, probably in two contexts, right? When you hear web scraping, and probably the reason why you're here today is that, oh, it's a cool technology. And there's a lot of like positive like research and like development around web scraping. But there's also the other side to it, where a lot of people online, like when you see captchas, like here in this wonderful meme, and then other like things that are blocking bots on the internet. So you might have also like seen the negative sides and like how people aren't a fan of bots. I want to clarify, like web scraping itself is not illegal or bad. It's just the way that how it's being done and like what the information is being used for that causes concern for people. Like if you're obviously trying to do like identity theft and you're like scraping people's information against their consent, that is bad. It's clearly being done out of malicious intent. But web scraping also has a lot of good applications. And so long as you don't like DDoS the site, I don't know if you guys have heard of it, that's denial of service. That's like overloading a website such that their servers can't handle the amount of traffic and they crash. So as long as you don't DDoS the site and you have permission to scrape from their site, I'll show you guys how to check that later, then you should be fine. But you should expect that if you're interested in web scraping and you try doing a bit more of this on your own, you may find that a lot of sites have anti-bot sort of things built into them. So just be aware that that's a thing, and you may have to like work around it while you're doing your scraping. Okay. Now we're going to hop into the demo. So what we are going to do with this workshop is we are going to build this little app of to recycle or not to recycle. I'm sure some of you guys have like found yourself holding something and being like, man, I wonder if I can recycle this or not. Like it's a kind of a daily, like trivial nuisance, right? All it takes is like a quick Google search and you can find whether or not it's recyclable pretty easily. But today we're going to try to automate that and see like how we can maybe expedite that process through web scraping. By that, I mean, there are a lot of articles online and they usually have like a blog component, a lot of stuff that you don't want to read and you just want to skip to the good stuff and see like what is recyclable. So what we're going to do is we're going to extract information from a web page and print it to a console, sorting out things that are only relevant to the item that we're trying to recycle. Now, you may be wondering or thinking that web scraping is a lot of work, right? And searching this up with Google is pretty fast. And you might be thinking, I'm doing a bunch of work to save me like 30 seconds of time. That seems sort of dumb. If you thought that, you're 100% correct. It is a little bit. But the whole reason why we're using the site is actually because of, or we're doing this activity is actually because of the site that we're using. It is super, it really lends itself to web scraping very well. And I'll describe a little bit more about why it's useful for web scraping after we do like the actual scraping and talk a bit more. Basically, all the instructions for this workshop are in this README. So we're just going to go through the steps together and see how the code executes. So before we start, though, there are a couple prerequisites we need to have downloaded. We're going to be doing all of this in Python 3. So if you don't have that, I recommend that you either go to python.org and download it or find an online IDE. I think REPL.it is pretty good for this sort of stuff, but most online IDEs should be pretty good so long as you have a terminal and can install these packages, which are requests and Beautiful Soup. The first thing we want to do is go to the particular article that we want to scrape. So as I said, like there's a little blog component, there's this little image with a pamphlet, but then the meat of what we're looking at is like these you can recycle and you can't recycle lists. So they basically sorted everything by like item type and then sorted them with the respective you can and cannot recycle things. So our goal is to grab everything in just the recycle sections because it's a little bit of a pain to first find the category and then find whether it's in the you can recycle portion. So we're just going to extract these parts and then add it into the mini database, which we can query with whatever we want to check. Okay, so that's basically the gist of it. But the first thing we want to do before we scrape any data is we want to see if we're allowed to scrape it. So I mentioned earlier this thing called robots.txt, and that's basically a convention for websites to have this so that people can see whether they're allowed to scrape. Robots.txt doesn't actually technically stop anyone from scraping a site, but it's good practice to check whether you are allowed to, just like on an ethical standpoint. URL is right here, but I'm going to show you guys how to get the URL directly from the site in case you haven't done this before. Basically, the robot.txt is like almost exclusively at like hosted under the main home folder of the domain. So get rid of the extra stuff indicating directly where our blog post is, and we do robots.txt. And you should see something like this pop up. So the part that's relevant to us, right, what we want to check for as people who want to scrape the site is this part. They specify like who is allowed to do what. And basically here with the star, they're saying anyone is allowed to scrape anywhere on the site. This slash means the home folder, so you can go anywhere within the site. And that's really good for us, right? That means we won't get into legal trouble if we get anything from this site. We like not being in legal trouble. That verifies that we are all good and that we can continue. We are now on step 3. This requires actually having the code. So what we're going to do is we're going to grab this code and download it. So for those of you who have Git, you can just like copy this URL and do a Git clone. If you don't have Git, you can download the zip here too. Unzip it and you should have like these 3 files in here. What you do is grab this URL. We're going to go to starter code, which is basically going to be the parts where we fill in. You'll notice that part A has been done for us. This is the same URL as the article that we're parsing, and this basically asks the user for whatever item they want to check. So we're going to start with part B, which is grabbing the data with a GET request. I don't know how familiar you guys are with like HTTP protocols, but the gist of a GET request is that it asks some endpoint or URL for some information, and that URL or like server will return information. When you pass in like a URL that happens to be a web page, the server returns all of the HTML for that web page, or all the code behind generating that web page. So what we're going to do is we're going to write that GET request by using the requests library from Python. We pass it the URL, and here we're just going to print all the text that is returned. This incidentally will be HTML code because we're requesting information from a website. It's going to ask you for something to recycle. This doesn't actually mean anything yet because we're not using it, but I'm just going to type in something like, I don't know, one thing I might want to check. And yeah, did you see that? That took like a few seconds just to print out all that stuff. Basically, we're going to get more HTML than we could ever hope to interpret by hand, right? So this is a part where we really need to like break it down to the components that we actually need. And the way we're going to do this is we're going to use a lovely library called Beautiful Soup. It's If you haven't heard of it, it's basically an HTML parser. You can find more information about it from the link in the README here, but basically what we're going to use it for is we're going to use it to target specific HTML tags that we want to extract from the website. Because as you guys might have noticed from here, right, like they have a bunch of JavaScript, they have a bunch of just like completely irrelevant things. And even when we get to the HTML stuff, right, they've got all of these like, you know, just dates, links, things that we don't actually need. So we're going to have to figure out which HTML tags we do want. And in order to do that, we have to go back to the website. And ultimately, the things we want to scrape, right? We want to scrape these bullet points. So how we're going to figure out like where they are in the code or what tags to use is we're going to think of a recyclable item that we want. Like in this case, phone books is something that like is recyclable and also isn't generally used out of context. Most people don't casually mention phone books. So what we're going to do is we're going to like take phone books and we're going to search the source code. So I'm going to grab this, copy it, and then right click on it or on the web page and click inspect. If you haven't used this before, it's basically a way for you to look at the web page's source code. What we're going to do is we're going to Command F and search up phone books. And as you can see, we have literally one instance of it showing up in our source code here. So since there's only one instance and it literally says it here, this must correspond to the bullet point that we're looking at. In fact, if we highlight it, oh, that's pretty nifty. They show us that this is actually where it's coming from. Now we know the inner workings of the site and we can see that this bullet point is surrounded by this tag that says strong. I believe that bolds the text. So that's super nifty. We found the sort of tags that we want, and now we can actually use Beautiful Soup to effectively sort on that tag or like filter. The way we're going to do that is we're going to go back to the instructions. We're going to grab this code here and put it in part C. Now, let me go over this. What these lines are doing is basically we're saying, okay, Beautiful Soup, take this HTML code that we extracted, which by the way, you should delete this print statement. It'll help with reading stuff. We're going to say, take the HTML code that was received from that GET request and then hit it with an HTML parser. That's going to, like Beautiful Soup is going to recognize each of the HTML tags and then like realize how to traverse the DOM. And then this next step here is saying, okay, now we're going to take that parsed thing and we're only going to search for the strong tabs or tags, and we can get rid of everything else. Items will contain only things that have a strong tag. And so we're going to print it here just to show ourselves that that works. I'm going to run this. Huzzah. You should still be getting fire hosed with information, but with less information. So as you might have noticed from this output, we've got a lot of strong tags and things included in it. You might have also noticed that there are things in it that aren't actually useful to us. Like they aren't recyclable, they aren't not recyclable, they're just like part of the blog. Just to see it more easily, you can grab some of the code from step 6 and print it all out in a list. Like this is just a for loop going through items. And as you can see, like once we extract the strong tags, which I did by doing item.text, because item was each of the things with the strong tags around them, you can see we have all of these bits of information. Like this is the stuff from the blog that we didn't actually want. And then we have recyclable items, and then we have not recyclable items here, yeah? But we only want the recyclable items. So question is, how do we get rid of the things that we don't want? This is the part where we've sort of gotten past like the act of web scraping itself and more into like basic logic of how we like deal with these strings. There are lots of ways to do it, and I'm just going to tell you guys like the approach that I took. It's probably not the most efficient way to do it, but here we are. Basically what I did was I took advantage of the structure of the website. You guys may have noticed, well, it's false advertising and it's certainly not a complete recycling list. they at least have a very good structure going where they like first have category and then the you can recycle and then you cannot section. So what I did was I took advantage of the structure, and every time I saw you can recycle, I grabbed everything after it until I saw you cannot recycle. So that requires going through each of these items and then sort of toggling a flag back and forth, just being like, if I see this, then all of the items afterwards, I'm going to include it in the list of things that are recyclable. And then for you cannot, then I would exclude everything. And that idea is basically encapsulated in this little bit of code here, which I'm going to put in part D. Yeah, so this basically just goes through each of the items, grabs like the text, or yeah, just the text, which we can see here looks a lot better than these tags. And it just checks them and all toggles the flag. If I'm in a phase where I should include stuff, I included that item in my recyclable list. Right. If you run that, it actually won't print anything because I haven't added any print stuff, but that's basically what that code does. I just got rid of the print statements up here so we can see what we actually want to see instead of this stuff down here. And now we're at the final part, right? This list here will basically contain all of the items that were recyclable from the website. So what we need to do is we're actually going to put like this part into play. I'm not sure if we lost that purpose along the way, but basically the whole point of this was to search up an item, right? And so this item, in all caps, is what we actually want to look for in our recyclable list. So what we're going to do is we could just check if it's in our recyclable list, but you know, people don't search things verbatim. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through every single recyclable item that we have and then see if what the user put in is actually prevalent in that list. This again is something that's like pretty much just like looping and parsing stuff that you all are probably familiar with. If not, I have the code here just for you to be able to look at. And if you run it, we should be prompted for an item again. This time I'm going to search for plastic, because why not? And there you go. We get a list of all these things that we can recycle. And like, as you can see, there are some things that are relevant, right? Like I'm looking for plastic and I'm not looking for shredded paper. But at least this is like reading this 6-item list is a bit faster than the article. If you want to learn more about like, if you want to verify your results, first of all, here's an example run, I think with the same stuff I showed in the console. And you can verify that you're getting the same items and verify that these things are indeed recyclable by comparing it with the article. Key takeaways. As you might have noticed, we spent most of the time in this workshop just like staring at the website and looking at the source code and just like basically figuring out how the site is structured. And that's because that is actually like super important for scraping. In order to effectively get the data you want, you have to really know the structure of your website. And as you can imagine, that makes scraping a lot of websites at once a little bit more difficult, right? Either like you kind of have to balance between having very specific parsing versus making sure it's compatible with lots of different structures of websites. So that's something to keep in mind if you plan on doing more web scraping in future. This is also a tip I have in general, sites with lots of JavaScript. So I mentioned back to like when we first started the demo, right? That like, yeah, I know this like app is a little bit strange to be doing for something that's pretty quick to do with Google. Their web scraper is like very solid, yeah? But the whole reason why I had to do it is because it was actually a very convenient site to scrape. And by that, I meant it's pretty much comprised of HTML. We saw some JavaScript, but there was a lot of HTML and all the stuff we were interested in had HTML. Furthermore, it also allowed us to scrape stuff. So that was the robots, TXT stuff. Initially, I had planned on doing like an ethical fashion app where we would like, because everyone's shopping online now, it'd be really nice to know if your brands are ethical and stuff, but it's kind of hard to find. But the site I was trying to scrape was full of JavaScript. And oh my lord, trying to scrape that is actually very difficult. So keep that in mind. If you're trying to scrape stuff and you run into sites with lots of JavaScript, you can actually get some libraries to scrape that pretty easily, depending on the sites. And there are a lot of more tools being built around that. But be aware of that. It might be hard if you're trying to scrape it like we did today, or with even more rudimentary tools. Okay. And the last thing is that the next step would be to build a web crawler, right? Like we built a web scraper, to specifically extract information. But the other half to web scraping is crawling the internet to get information in an automated way. For that, I really suggest that you check out these resources down here. So I have like some things that go over things we did today, like high level overview. But there's this really extensive Python web scraping tutorial here. It allows you to scrape more things than just text. You can do things like media files and stuff like that. So very cool if you want to do like learn about web crawling and also interesting components. ScrapeHigh is also a very powerful web scraping tool, which you can use for this. That's a wrap, folks. Thanks for coming.